We left off doing a typological study of medieval cities, and we will continue that today. The typology last time was a typology of origin, of where cities came from in the Middle Ages, the bulk of which were cities of Roman origin, but then with these burgs and eventually organic growth towns, planted towns, and bastides developing between the end of the Roman world and the late Middle Ages, when we have the emergence of the market. Market functions begin to come back around the 11th to 12th centuries. And so regardless of what the origin of one of these five types was, they all tended to develop by this time in such a way that they all had the exact same components. And while they may have been slightly different in shape, the structural form of the medieval city all over Europe is pretty much the same. So we can continue in this typological mode, and the components of these medieval cities, there were six of them: the wall and the gate. All needed defense, and the gate was part of that, the portcullis. Second, the church and parvis as a unit. The parvis was the space in front of the church, and it was used in a variety of ways. It was used for religious celebrations of various kinds. It was used as a kind of space where edicts would be posted, other kinds of things would occur. And initially, when the church was in control of the market, you might have had some market functions in the parvis. It's simply a space in front of the church, that's all, but it should be considered as part of the church. Like the wall and gate, the church and parvis were a single unit. The parvis will later develop, as we'll see, into the piazza in many cases, and will take on different functions. The third is the castle, or in French, the chateau, and the keep, or the donjon, where our word dungeon comes from. This is the innermost protected part of the seat of the feudal lord. All else fails. All other defense works fail. This is where you would have kept your most prized possessions, your gold, your jewels, whatever it may be, anything that would have ensured your welfare in case of attack, including prisoners. You would put prisoners in here in order to ransom or to collect ransom from one of your rivals. The fourth is the street. The street is really, as I said at the very beginning of this course, is really the structural element of all cities for all time. And markets change, cultures come, cultures go, technology comes, technology goes, but streets, once they're constructed, the rights of way tend to stay with us for a very, very long time. In some cases, such as in Edinburgh, the widened space in the street simply became a kind of market area. And we'll see streets changing names and changing functions. But there are two parts of this that I want to emphasize. The first is the strata or stratum, which means paved, that it was paved. It was the material itself. Street comes from this word strata, stratum. The other is the via. The via has an implication of purpose, that it is a way to something, right, from A to B. So if we see, again, to use the England example, to use England as an example, in the Middle Ages, the highway, via, which is where way comes from, would convert to the high street at the moment that it passes through the gate of the walled city. And then finally, after about 1300, we begin to get the emergence of a distinct space, a new kind of space associated with market activities. And slowly, over a long period of time, the various guilds and other economic transformations of medieval cities will ultimately wrest away control of market functions from the traditional forms of authority, the church, the landlord, so forth, and ultimately will become autonomous in and of themselves. But this occurs late. And we'll see that in many cases you would have a cross, a market cross that would be planted, so to speak, in the marketplace just to remind everybody who was really in charge. And then finally, the sixth component, which should be considered as part of the city, which is agricultural territory. And in the normal sense, this would be outside the walls and would include territory that was controlled by the city, people leaving the city, going out into the fields to work and coming back through the gates at night. But in some cases, as Siena, as examples we'll see here, you actually would have had agricultural territory inside the wall. So that, like the cistern in the old Mycenaean cities, in time of attack, you would then have the ability to actually feed yourself to some degree, a place to graze some sheep, graze a cow, do something inside the actual wall of the city. So the rest of this lecture will simply be then examples of these six components. And as I said, regardless of whether it was a city of Roman origin or what Morris calls organic growth town or a burg or a bastide, all of these components would be present in these cities regardless of their origin. Begin with the wall and gate. We've been to Aigues-Mortes, a planted town that was associated with the defense of a series of very important salt works in the south of France. And the space at the bottom of the wall, which was called in German a bulwark, which will later in French become the boulevard, and we will discuss that in greater detail much later. These streets were, by and large, very narrow. The streets of the town, very narrow, dark. They would have smelled particularly bad, unless it was a town of Roman origin that still had a functioning sewer system. Most of the sewage simply went into cesspits or out in the streets. You can see here how the gate or the wall comes across the street at a particular point here at Tollignan in France, and that is actually not atypical. You would see, in some cases, a division between the religious part of the city and the market part of the city, such as in Salisbury, or you would actually have a series of gates that would, as you move into the inner part of the city, that could be closed and protected. This is a reconstruction, a modern reconstruction in the alignment of the Roman wall in York. And it's sort of funny because a lot of people use this as a commuting system to go to work at present time. You'll actually see guys in suits with briefcases and umbrellas walking along this wall on their way to the office. It's really kind of funny. San Gimignano in Italy, Tuscan example dating to the 13th century. And then in Edinburgh, United Kingdom, Scotland, that's actually the entrance into the castle and keep, which was the most fortified part. This opened out then into the high street, which again contained the Lawn Market, eventually changed its name to Canongate. There was a gate there which led into the Bishop's Palace, or the Holyrood Palace, which is the name of it. We will see San Gimignano again because actually each of the houses and the families within San Gimignano actually were fortified in and of themselves, each with a defensible tower. And you know the stories from reading Romeo and Juliet that these families did not like each other very much, actually often would fight, so that this family could not intermarry with that family and so on. At Loches, one of the most medieval cities that probably remains, going back to the Carolingian period, that's the reign of Charlemagne, back to the 9th century. But this, what we see here, is actually the outer gate, which dates to about the 15th century. It's 1400s, much, much later. you begin to see how the Faubourg, that is the market town that begins to develop outside the wall, just outside the wall, as we see here with its boucherie and charcuterie and all the sort of typical French wonderful things that one finds in such places. In England, the ecclesiastical division, the church, actually had its own portion of the city, and it was enclosed by a wall. This was called a close, and the actual territory was called a see, S-E-E, separated from the secular economic part of the city. On the left is Christchurch Gate in Canterbury, leading into Canterbury Cathedral, which after the split from the papacy, ultimately the Archbishop of this place, Canterbury, became the head of the Church of England, and late in the time of Henry VIII. And then the gate on the right is in Salisbury. We're actually in the economic part of the town, looking through into, you can see the spire of Salisbury Cathedral rising up right there behind it. This included the school, it included the Bishop's Palace, it included all sorts of activities that were associated with the church. At the center of the medieval town, of course, was the most protected part, the castle and keep. Again, this is a single unit. The keep, or the donjon, was simply the interior, most defensible part of the walled inner city. In some cases, no other city developed around it, such as the one at the bottom in Spain, which is actually going all the way back to the 12th century, and then Edinburgh, which built up over time and is now a major tourist attraction. Nonetheless, we see it there on this extinct volcanic core, this basalt core of a hill that was surrounded on three sides by a lake in the Middle Ages. Again, Loches, one of the most interesting and some of the best preserved of the early medieval towns that we have anywhere, really in Europe, anywhere in Europe, is really built around a monastery which was founded in the late Roman period in the 5th century. But the fortress passed into the hands of the Counts of Anjou. Anjou actually was a territory that still is a territory on the Loire Valley, but it was the Counts of Anjou became the kings of England and actually counted what is today England in their possessions along with the Bordeaux. I mentioned that earlier. In fact, some of these people were fairly famous. Richard the Lionheart, for example, was one of the Counts of Anjou. Henry II, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, that's the Bordeaux. They spoke French. And they, at this point in time, the King of France is really reduced to sort of the King of Orleans, and the Counts of Anjou really controlled today what is about half of France and all of it, just about all of England, except for Scotland. And this one is particularly well preserved. We see the keep here inside of this defensible area on the high ground with a moat around it. And then this is actually in the interior of this. You can see here where the floors were suspended. And you could, in fact, they would often lock people up in here because no one could, it was the most, it was like the vault of a bank in effect. Here we see Chinon. This is the ancestral home of the Counts of Anjou. Very good wine comes from Chinon today. But this was the home of Richard the Lionheart and his son, Henry II and his two sons, Richard the Lionheart and Bad King John of Magna Carta fame was the younger son of Henry II. This is Chinon as well. We're looking across the river here, across the Loire. And again, we see this sort of bifurcated town with the emergence of the Faubourg down in the valley, and then the city, the citadel up on the top, which consists of two parts, a part that is the most defensible, and then a part that is actually where everybody lived. And then the people who, this Faubourg that developed on the downhill side of this, which eventually became the city itself. That's the view from up there. And most of these buildings date to the 15th, 16th century. They're fairly late. But that's the view actually from the chateau at Chinon. The streets, we discussed Augusta Pretoria, which is transformed into the medieval city, still there, of Aosta. And you can see the way in which the Roman pattern of regularized orthogonal blocks or insula actually have been eroded into this irregular pattern. I tend to think of this as being sort of like a cookie or something that someone has set out on the table and kind of smashed. You know what I mean? It breaks up. And Rome, if you squint your eyes, Rome today in the Campo Marzio, you can still see some of the block patterns of the original city, but all the streets kind of weave around it. And in many cases, buildings that were perhaps public buildings were either torn down and used for other things, or in some cases, theaters, for example, would become residential buildings. Now, if we pause here for a moment and think about that, let's go back to Rome for a moment and think about this population decline from 1.3 million down to about 50,000 over about a 600-year period. That would be the equivalent of Georgia Tech, it's what, 22,000, 23,000 students right now? Do the same ratio. You will come down to something about the size of the College of Architecture, right? So everything else goes away and you're left with 900 students or something, right? And then over time, your tuition can't, cover the cost of maintaining all of your dorm rooms. And eventually the toilets break and the plumbing can't be repaired, right? So what do? You either go over into McCamish Pavilion, still want to call it Alexander Memorial Coliseum, and you find a toilet and you a sink or something, you rip it out of the wall and you take it back to your room. But then when the infrastructure in the building gets to a point where it no longer works, you might actually decide to move into McCamish Pavilion, right? And you sort of hang up curtains and put up block wall or, whatever you can do. You sort of make do, and you end up with something like Bobby Dodd Stadium actually becoming a residential building, right? Where the residential buildings are abandoned and the weeds grow and the things are knocked down, moved around, reused any way that they can. It's a sort of make do situation. And that's what we see here. That's why these streets are all departing in this kind of strange way. And we see the same thing in Damascus. We see the same thing, interestingly enough, to foreshadow the next lecture, in the Arabic world as well. And that is that ultimately the pattern, even if it started out at the Roman city, there's a departure from that very specific, in the case of the Arabic cities, in very specific ways. Here, it's a kind of randomness, as to what survives and what doesn't survive. As long as it was functional, then it was kept. If it was a temple or something and could be converted to Christian worship in Europe, it was. If it was a late Christian church in Byzantium, in the Byzantine world, it could be converted into a mosque, it was, right? So these things were sort of rewritten. You sort of are inscribing new meanings on top of it. Structurally, what we see here is this sort of make-do departure from the orthogonal geometry of the Roman city. These streets were not very pleasant. There was a question last time about why in the world were these streets so narrow, right? Well, again, you think about it, it's just a make-do. It's just purely utilitarian. There are no market functions, and so you don't need to have shop fronts. You don't need to have, it's basically just a place where you lived and slept. And then you went out and worked in the fields, all in the hope of a better life in the world to come. That eschatological component. Slowly over time, by the 12th, 11th, 12th centuries, when we begin to get the stability within that feudal system, controlling a large enough territory so that you're not constantly under threat of attack, you begin to have then the emergence of these market functions where trade begins to reappear. Part of this, as I mentioned, was a function of this terrible 200-year period or so that had to do with the fights between the Christian Europe, Christian north, on the Muslim south, over the area of what is now Lebanon and Israel and Syria and so forth. But again, in the long run, there was a benefit that came from that. For example, if I were to say write down the numbers 1973, or give me your phone number, you would write them in Arabic enumeration, right? Algebra, right? It's Arabic. They were still using Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 3. There's no higher math in any way. These great buildings that were built, like the Gothic cathedrals and so forth, which really are incredible buildings, were built from templates that were sort of protected knowledge that the Masons kept going all the way back to the Roman world. So you would apprentice and become a Mason, thus you get Freemasons, people who could eventually enter into contracts because there was a demand for their services. It was a skilled labor that the church needed. And it was all built from templates, from knowing how many I need. I need 10 of these number 12, number 8, whatever it is, stones in order to span this distance. It was all done rule of thumb, and no higher math, no calculus. I would have loved to have lived. I had 7, we were on a quarter system when I was an undergraduate. I had 7 quarters of math. And I always tell people my colleagues at Georgia Tech that, which is, of course, very impressive until I tell them that it was all the same course. That's funny. So feel free to laugh. It's a true story, too. Same course 7 times. Passed it on the 7th go. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here. A world without calculus was the kind of place I would like to live. It's funny. If you're an architect or a landscape architect, the math that is the most useful is trigonometry. I mean, you use it all the time, right? You lay out arcs and tangents and subtend arcs and do all of that. Well, I mean, it's a sort of complex geometry. It's not taught anymore. It's incredible. I don't understand that. I really don't. Instead, we all have to suffer through calculus, which you will never use if you are an architect. You will never use again in your entire life, right? Maybe when you size a beam, that's a little bit, but that's it. Because you're going to hire somebody to size that beam. You better know enough to know what they're doing, but you're not going to size it yourself unless you're completely crazy, right? This is Chinon down in the Faubourg, and it is, in fact, the widest street in the town. This is actually, these buildings that you see, these half-timbered buildings, date from the 14th, mid-13th to the late 14th century. The stone ones that you see on the left are a little bit later 16th century. Now, I mentioned that in some cases, you see the sidewalk. The sidewalks here would indicate that on the left that this was a Roman street. And Siena on the right, a little bit closer to Rome than York is, actually did not have sidewalks. And sidewalks, for example, in Paris will not come back until the Pont Neuf is constructed under Henry IV in the late 16th century. And it will be the first construction in Paris during the Middle Ages since the Roman period that actually had sidewalks. But the point is that you notice here that the streets start to get on the right a little bit wider because market functions begin to develop. And as they develop, buildings begin to get facades again. Something that if you go back and look at Loesch or you go back and look at some of those other streets, the facade has by and large disappeared. This departure that I mentioned, again, to foreshadow a little bit, here you can see it perfectly well. This is the old part of Damascus. On the left at the top is the site of the Roman Forum. On the right was actually the Greek Agora, which has now pretty much completely disappeared. The street called Straight, that is not a joke, that is the name of the street, and it runs all the way through the city. It's one of the oldest streets in the world. And you will see these dash lines, which is indicating the sort of grid structure, the block structure here of the Hellenistic city in the Roman period, but heavily influenced from the Greek world, Seleucid. This was part of the Seleucid world. But then you'll notice that there are areas, including the site of the Agora, including the site of the Forum, and including the site of down here, of these little cul-de-sac streets, because what you've got is then a cultural condition that we're going to explore where that comes from in the next lecture, but it's brought in, and there is a departure, a very deliberate departure from that block structure into this cul-de-sac arrangement. In some cases, actually building up inside of what was, in fact, originally large public space. This is the Great Mosque of Damascus. But it doesn't matter. If you look at this and you look at the components, what do you have? You have a wall and a gate. You have streets. You have the castle and keep. There we see it right there. You have the religious building that we see here. In this case, market functions on the outside right there around it. That's the Great Mosque of Damascus, which began life actually as part of the Forum, was converted into use in Christian worship, and then later in the Islamic period, it becomes a mosque. It's actually a hospital at one point in time. In other words, all of the elements that are present in these medieval European cities are also present here. That is interesting. The difference is the presence of these little cul-de-sac streets. If you go back and look, for example, at Aosta, you will not see these little dead-end streets. Even in Edinburgh, you will not see these little dead-end streets. But in the pre-Islamic world, pre-Islamic Arabic world, you actually will see these. I think this is, in fact, a kind of cultural intervention, and we will see in the next lecture where those little cul-de-sac streets come from. If you remember, it goes all the way back to Ur. It goes all the way back to Assur. It goes way back into the second and third and even fourth millennium of the before the Common Era. The church in Parvis. Most of these medieval European cities, of course, are known for their great, huge Gothic buildings. This is Notre Dame in Paris. The two towers were never built. And if you'll notice on the right, you will see that the Parvis is much smaller than it is today on the left. And that is because in the 19th century, we began to admire these not as places of worship as much as we did historic artifacts. In fact, in 1832, all of the churches in France were taken out of the hands of the clergy and put under the control of the Commission of Historic Monuments. In other words, there's a shift that occurs, right? It's secularized to a degree. Now, you go here on Sunday, and there'll be services in here, and the choir will be singing and so on and so forth, and everybody in it will either be my age or 14. Nobody in between. You get to my age, you start worrying about what comes next, so you're there, and then you want to make sure the kids get a good foundation, so they're in there. I'm being only slightly tongue-in-cheek. In Italy, that's certainly the case today. But you'll notice that this is actually a much, much smaller place, and that the city is coming right up to it. Now, that's important because there was no place in medieval Paris where you could have seen this building, the facade of this building in this way, right? Instead, it was almost like you were reading a text, like it was just right up on you, right? I think we tend today to think of these as enormous objects because we tend to fetishize the object, whereas in the world that they were built in, actually they were simply walls that were enormous walls that you were right up against. Those who were either unclean or whatever reason, alms would be distributed by the clergy to people who had gathered here. Passion plays during Easter and so forth would play out here. But we actually, again, see this where all of this has been cleared. And if you go to Paris today and you're walking around in front of this, look at the pattern of pavement, because the paving pattern in this Parvis of Notre Dame actually shows you where the old city, the buildings, the outline of the buildings actually used to be. And there's a museum underneath that shows it as well. So Strasbourg, which was a Roman city that actually developed into a burg, I think is one of the few where we still get the sense of that the parvis, the space. It's not an object. We don't see the building as an object. We see it as almost like a text, a wall with all of this material on it, biblical stories, Christ in judgment, the heavenly hosts, all kinds of things here on the tympanum. It's very important that the congregation understood exactly who was in charge, so that you're actually experiencing it at this level, very closely up around the building. That will become significant in the Renaissance when we begin to see the construction of straight streets that are trying to sort of create, sort of objectify to some degree these buildings and it as important things at the end of some axial relationship. Here's the model of Ile de la Cité in Paris, which shows Notre Dame, and then the city coming right up to it. All of this has been cleared today. Same as Notre Dame on the left. Also, a Chartres on the right, which is certainly one of the great buildings of the world. Really extraordinary. Hard to imagine, actually, anybody building something like that out of stone over such a long period of time. But if you go to the south facade, there's no place where you can actually sort of get the whole building it really is, you're right up on it. Even with a 28 millimeter lens on your camera, or a 16 millimeter lens, you still can't get back far enough to get the whole thing in view, which is your tendency. Instead, you're reading it much more like a text. And so here you have something taken from the ancient world. I mean, we see Horus and Isis and Horus. We see Hera and eventually Mary and Jesus sitting on the throne, often with a pomegranate in one hand or an orb in one hand, being tended to by angels. Angels are Roman in origin. If you look at the Septimius Severus, the arch of Septimius Severus, I should have pointed that out. There are angels coming, bringing the standards up to the apotheosis of Septimius. And then the heavenly hosts, then the heavenly hosts all around it, which of course are telling stories about what happens if you're good and what happens if you aren't, right? And so it was a pretty powerful incentive to be good. On Chartres Cathedral, we have everybody. We have Aristotle up there, Plato up there. We have Masons up there. We have the wool makers up there. We have the kings of Judea up there. There's just about everybody is somehow ensconced up in this remarkable building. Now in England, the parvis was grass, and this seems odd, but it will become important when we move into the 18th and 19th centuries with the invention of what we today call landscape and the impact of that on cities. Why was it grass? Anybody in here tennis fans? All right. What is Wimbledon? What's the surface it's played on? Grass. Right. French Open, played on clay. Grass grows in England like pine trees grow in Georgia. Okay? It just grows. The reason the Romans were interested, sheep, wool, a little bit of tin, some other stuff, but it was the wool. And grass just grows. So when you go to Cambridge, you go to Oxford, and you see these, over here, we spend enormous sums of money trying to get grass to grow. We import it from Japan. Zoysia is from Japan, right? We irrigate it, we cultivate it, we fertilize it, we do everything to try to get the grass to grow, because there aren't any native long grasses in North America. None. And so we have to import all of our grasses. Bermuda, Bahia is South American actually, from Africa, from Asia, from all sorts of places. Festuca arundinacea, which is fescue, comes from England, English pasture grass. People over here at the University of Georgia or at Clemson in the horticulture departments and the agricultural schools, scientists over there trying to hybridize fescue so that it will withstand the Georgia heat, in July and August. Doesn't. Never been successful with that. If you're in France and you're in a park and you get on the grass and sit down, except on Sunday between the hours of 1 and 5 when you're allowed, a policeman will come along and blow his whistle and tell you to get off the grass. You will see signs, Pelus, interdit, all right, forbidden. Whereas in England, it's just everywhere. People sit on it, play tennis on it. All these lawn sports that are so popular in the world today really have their origins, as we'll see in the 18th and 19th century, with the invention of mechanical mowing, because it's kind of hard to play tennis if you're having to avoid the sheep droppings, right? So you have to be able to clear it out, pack it down, and all of that comes about in the 19th century. Golf, same kind of thing. It's kind of hard. I mean, you can't, anyway. So in England, all the parvis are grass, but that is because they use it like pavement. They use it like paving. It's like stone everywhere else. That was Winchester, by the way. So we're actually standing at B, which is the site of the Forum, Roman Forum, looking at the church. The English never really could figure out how to make a Gothic church. I'm sorry, I'm just getting wound up here, but they really couldn't. They just gave up, never knew how to make an apse. They just cut it off in the back, made it square. Wells, a gorgeous little building, the so-called perpendicular style, which looks awfully squat to be called perpendicular. But again, you have grass as the parvis. Now, this ecclesiastical compound that we see here, including the bishop's house, this was a town of Roman origin, began as a castrum. There's a school over here, and then it is enclosed completely. And we'll see that in a minute. I'll point that out in a moment when we come to the market. As I mentioned, by the 13th century, we began to get the emergence of an autonomous marketplace. The terms, of course, depending upon the language, plots, the English square, they never could quite figure out, as we'll see, what a piazza actually was. They thought it was an arcade. Anybody here from Charleston, South Carolina? Charleston? Have family in Charleston? Been to Charleston? Okay. Down on the Battery, if you know anybody who lives on the Battery, those beautiful houses with the side porches? At some point, they will say, let's go out on the piazza. And the first time anybody said that to me, I thought, what in the world are they talking about? It's a porch, right? And so we're sitting up on the second floor on this porch, which they call a piazza. And it's this weird holdover from the British in the 17th century getting confused about what a piazza was. They thought it was actually a portico, okay? But anyway, plots, piazza, plaza, campo. So the British call it a square, even though none of them were ever square. Campo means field. So what we have, if we look over here, is medieval Munich. There's our church in Parvis, and we begin to see the emergence here of an autonomous marketplace. This is, of course, in Rothenburg, very famous Bavarian town. And then Alnwick in Northumbria on the lower left, which includes this market cross, and the Campo dei Fiori, which some of you are very familiar with here in Rome. This, by the way, is the Theater of Pompey. It's still in there. So this is the marketplace in Wells, and this is what I was talking about a moment ago. We see here where the gates are actually into the ecclesiastical compound. So if you go through that gate, behind these buildings, over here, you actually have this grass parvis that is in front of the cathedral at Wells. This, of course, is Wells was well watered, and that's where it takes its name. And this was the town water supply. And we're looking actually at a fragment here of the alignment of the Roman Cardo. Then the second street that's just to the left of this comes in at a right angle, which was the Decumanus. Same thing here in Winchester, the Roman city. At the entrance into the Forum, where the market eventually developed. And again, we see this market cross where the church is putting its stamp of of authority into the secular economic part of the town. We tend to look at these things today, again, as objects of beauty or historical monuments, their values and their history. And I would like to remind you that this is a world where people were hung in front of that cross for violating some rule, that this was a symbol of a very important, rigid kind of authority. It is not where you sort of stroll looking for a Starbucks or a place to have lunch. There you see another better view of it here on the left, and then on the right in the market square itself in Salisbury. The church is behind its own walled compound. Here we actually see the market cross in Salisbury. And then here in Cambridge, from the top of the church of St. Mary's, there you actually see the market square as it is functioning today, actually. And in some cases, even though the buildings, of course, date to the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the names of the streets actually still betray their original functions within the market portions of the town: Butcher Row, Fish Row, so on and so forth. And then finally, the agricultural territory that was tied to the town. Again, this is southern France, and here in Montalcino in Italy. And then here, I was talking earlier about this. Here we see the wall in Siena with the gate, and then here you see this agricultural territory in the valleys here, which could in fact be defended and could function to provide some food supply in time of attack. And that's what it looks like very late in the day. I had to open the camera up, pretty substantial, but I'm not sure. I think these are operating on Victory Gardens today. I think you can lease a plot of land for, a few euros per year or something, as long as you maintain it. So these are the components of the medieval town, and I'll go back to that slide so that you might want to sort of study that slide as well as the one that precedes it. Are there any other questions? No questions. All right. Well, for those who, there is one. Aaron. Well, Siena was actually three hill towns that grew together through a process of Stoicism. And so the agricultural land is in the valley, and they kept it as a kind of reserve. So the wall was, as Wycherley says about the Greek city, the wall was loosely flung about the city. The wall was built around Siena and included that agricultural territory within it. Okay, so it's really on three ridges like a Y. We'll see more about that next week. Any other questions?